You can use Photoshop to design graphics intended for the web. Maybe it's an entire map of a layout, or perhaps some buttons or a banner. So let's get started. Here's an example of a layout that might be intended for the web, and maybe we're going to take the entire thing and set it up for the web, or perhaps just focus on some buttons or some banners area. In any case, when you're working on images that you're going to be sending to the web, it's really important to have an idea of the actual pixels that you're going to be using in the final production, because you want to just create them in an optimal format from the get-go. And when you're creating a new document, you can use the web preset, which will ensure that you're in the correct resolution of 72, the correct color mode, and it will even use this color profile of sRGB, which is a standard version of the RGB color mode. Now, you can also customize the width and height, and usually there's a good frame that you're going to be working with depending on your site. And it might be for a page, or it might be for an actual or a button, for example. And there are some default sizes in here that work pretty well. This is still pretty much the standard because all the monitors out there can vary. But let's go ahead and just start with that, and I'll click on cancel because I have one already set up in place. And when I'm working on my web graphics, I really like to take advantage of groups in order to isolate the different pieces. And so you can start seeing what's going on here. And with my banner, I could bring in an image, brought that image in, and then I could even add a mask to it to create this effect. Now, when I'm working with these masks, I like to use vector shapes. I'm going to go here and use my rectangle tool. And I want to make sure that it's in the shape mode, and I can pick a color that I want to use. And just so you can see something different, let's pick a green color here. And then I can come over to the bottom and I can draw a shape. And this allows me to create a shape, but because it's a vector shape, it's a lot easier to resize, specifically with pixels in mind. And I'm going to make sure I have my shape tool here, and I can resize it, or I can even use my move tool. And there's actually, I should say, the path selection tool allows me to work on the path. And when I had that path selection tool, I could also change my width and height. But that just makes it really handy if I wanted to have a specific width and height in mind. For example, 600 by 450. And you often do know exactly what you want. And then we can position that. Let's see here. Let's go to our move tool. Let's try moving it this way. It's being a little. Let's try moving that. I'll use my nudge tool. Sometimes the mouse, I probably had a key selected somewhere in the options, so if I just use the nudge, and kind of helps it move out. But there you go. You get the idea of how you can position your elements on the page. And then I can put that all into the background, and I could even lock. Oh, I know why I had it locked. I could lock that layer, and if that layer is locked, then I can't move the items around. So that gives me some handy options in there. And then as I start building up the banner, I can start adding my elements, for example, some text, and maybe put in some different elements. And here I actually added a line across, and again, using the rectangle tool. And I actually use the rectangle tool instead of the line tool, because the rectangle tool allows you to have a thicker line effect. But again, that advantage is you can go in and change the width and height of it in a way that's a lot easier to work with, because Photoshop doesn't always think in terms of vectors. Use some tools that helps you with it. Now, as I'm looking again at this, I could also use my sidebar. And in my sidebar, I've gone ahead and set up some buttons. But let me show you an option that you can do here. I'm going to change the zoom. I'm going to go ahead and remove some of these layers. And I'm using my selection tool, so it makes it easier to move them. But now I'll just go ahead and select these items, and looks like I need to select these items here and just throw them to the trash. Okay. What you might do is set up your starting point of your rectangle and your item, and you can just select it, and you can just hold down your shift. Sometimes I forget that I'm in Photoshop. You can hold down your shift and you can select it, and then you can drag it on top and make a duplicate layer, and you just nudge. You just get your move tool and nudge down. I'm using my down arrow to just nudge it into place until I have that position, and I continue doing that. Use my move and my nudge arrow. Got to make sure I'm on the right tool here. And I could set that up until I've got the buttons in place. And then it's just a matter of going into my type tool and changing the text to what I want to use. Well, it's also kind of handy to group some of these items. Now, there's different strategies of this. One way is to group the buttons themselves. But a lot of times what I like to do is actually group all the text together and group all the buttons together. So I'm going to go ahead and move the text in the stacking order, select them all, and group them. I can use Control G, that's an easy way to group them, and select all the buttons and group them. And it's nested inside a larger group, but now it's a lot easier for me to work on these buttons independently. I can lock one of the entire groups in there, so I could lock those buttons, and that way I don't have to worry about moving things or changing things around. And I could even use it to make duplicates for other versions. And that comes into the idea of working with layer comps. So you've created this really nice layout, and you've gone and made some of those changes in here, and you can go ahead and take advantage of layer comps to experiment with some different solutions. So I'm going to go ahead and start with my original here. But if I decided that I wanted to have the buttons a different color, well, I'm going to select all of them, and it's handy because I've had them all in this group, and I'm going to use my vector tool, and with vector I'm going to change the color, and let's try something pretty dramatic like bright red. You can see the results. Oops, let's make sure I have them all selected. I'll select them. There we go. Now they're all selected. Go back to my vector, my shape tool here, change the fill color to bright red, and you can see how they all update instantly, and it was really easy to select them because they're all organized a certain way. And then I can create a layer comp, and actually let's make sure all of those features are available, and I'll call this red. And I'll make another one where I'm going to go back to that other color that we had, kind of a brown color. We'll call this brown. And we could start making some changes or even have some options where the layers are visible or not. I might have had to do that as a style. Let's see. Yeah, it looks like instead of setting this up as a fill color, I would have gone instead and used my style options. And so that would have been a better way to do that and create a color overlay. But I can also use this for things like, do I want to have my group visible, my text visible, or hidden? And that would be a good example of using my different options. Maybe there's one where there is no wheelbarrow at the bottom. So these perhaps I would probably have to change it because I need these styles. But let's try this one with the wheelbarrow, where I create one with no wheelbarrow. And I'll go back to my original versus my no wheelbarrow, and you can start seeing that. And you can save the layer comps with your Photoshop file so that you can return to different versions of them. Now, another thing that you may want to do is take a closer look at the background here. Not all backgrounds are going to be easy to turn into web graphics. So the fact that this graphic back here has a lot of variation means that you're going to have to make a larger graphic instead of having one that can be small and tile quickly. Plus, the fact that it doesn't fade very easily into the background means that you're going to have some solid background around it because all the monitors can be different sizes. And so for that sake, I might decide, I'm going to go ahead and unlock this layer here. I might decide that I want to create some different background options. So here's the wheelbarrow, but you can easily create backgrounds by just filling it with a gradient or a pattern fill, and you could create some effect that you want. And this would be easier to tile over and over again. Let me just change the stacking order here. So this is something I could easily tile over and over again, and instead of having to create a large graphic, and I could even do something like a fade out along the edge. And again, you can also use a gradient pattern, and I might just try something with, this is pretty intense, but you get the idea. You could try a gradient pattern and perhaps have something that's more linear that just goes straight down. And as you're using these patterns or these different backgrounds, again, you could take advantage of your layers, and we could do something where we create a layer called brick. And we choose OK, and we can see here's the original, and here's the one with the brick. So it gives you some ideas because it's just about the visibility here. As you are working on your, let's go ahead and hide some of these. As you're working on your items too, and you're trying to place, you might want to take advantage of, in your view menu, the ability to show pixel grids and smart guides. It makes it a lot easier, or actually even here the grid, makes it easier to place images. However, those grids, maybe it'd be better if I locked that now. Those grids are a nice way of lining things up, but you want to make sure the grid is in the increments that you can work with. So let's go to Edit, Preferences, Grid, Guides, Grids, and Slices. And in here we can change the color of our guides and our grids. In fact, sometimes that gray is hard to see, so we can make it a different color to something that'd be easier to see. And you can also change the increments. I'm going to set up a grid every 100 pixels with a 10 pixel division, and because our image is in 600 pixels, it gives me nice even options, and it makes it easier for me to snap items when I'm drawing them, especially those vector shapes. So you have a lot of resources available to create graphics for the web. You just want to think ahead of time about your final destination, where you're going to be putting those graphics, and what the size is going to look like. Now it's time for a pop quiz. How do you change the color of the grids and guides? A, File, Preferences, Guides, Grids, and Slices. B, Edit, Preferences, Guides, Grids, and Slices. C, View, Show, Guides, Grids, and Slices. D, Window, Show, Guides, Grids, and Slices. The answer is B. Use the Edit menu to Preferences, Guides, Grids, and Slices to change the color as well as the increments.